curious, that problem within modernism, that you can have great poetry with appalling politics.
The political agenda is really quite nasty, yes. And
you're being polite, nasty.
yeah, and it runs through the high modernists, doesn't it? Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, Pound.
Includes D.H. Lawrence.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
if you start looking very carefully.
A kind of, in the 20s, maybe genteel anti-Semitism was fashionable, but...
well, it quickly becomes ungenteel.
Yeah.
For example, in one period of Pound's work, he did, of course, apologize later, that it was a mistake. I mean, I don't think we have time to go into that, but the kind of mistake it was, it's truly meant. But after what happened, an apology seems hardly adequate. What you want to know is what is the political operation of things that allows such horrors to burst out of the Western tradition as it turns democratic.
Yeah. But
or
then
tries to.
I mean, but they are all anti-democratic, aren't they? I mean, there's.
Well, what they seem to be worried about. It's all a problem of authority. They're worried about we've got this business of mass that they all worry about. Now, to be called a mass person or from the masses, that's really pretty weird. What you have to do is go back and say, now, who's looking at me and saying I'm mass?
Right.
This is precisely what any of us, as we belong to the masses, must say back. Who in the hell are you looking at me and calling me masses? There ain't no such thing in the ultimate pleasure of writing for it. But all of those modernists got drawn in out of the high, visionary, beautiful realms of poetry. They all got drawn into the worry about the order of things, the social order of things. And it's very curious indeed how many of them decided to go for an authoritarian order.
Right.
So that they move to see, how do we keep this in order while and so on, and we wind up with all of the errors that George Bowring has in mind when he says Canada went quickly to postmodernism.
It's also the colonial status too, isn't it? That lingered and perhaps lingers in Canada.
Well, yes, you'll have people who still think as colonial, but in my own experience of this, the largest argument is that we are not colonial. In addition to this, we are not going to be a colony of the United States.
Well, that's, yes.
And
right.
then the
having
row,
avoided England.
Yeah.
Yes, right, okay.
The row really begins. And so there's pride and concern about a different political tradition, that is to say, the parliamentary as against the American legislative. And then that may go, that can go in many directions. That can go in a very strong liberal direction, or it can go in a direction that wants to be conservative, small c, conservative in maintaining a sense of an inheritance from England, the mother of parliaments and so on, that would somehow give a measure of freedom, rather than, as George Grant in Lament for a Nation, wonderful small c conservative man, but a man with a sophisticated and philosophical mind, would argue that Americans with their revolution believe that they have total freedom. And now these are not matters that I wish to judge today. But you like to put them together, and you're going to experience in them, as I'm certain you do in some part, in the work you do with Canadian literature.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
There's another strain, though, of modernism that doesn't go to Europe. I mean, William Carlos Williams, and that defines itself, and Bowring coming out of that, too.
They do. Now, if you go at Williams first, and certainly Bowring has a strong connection with William Carlos Williams. William Carlos Williams has that complicated thing of trying to imagine an art in place, which is to say that he's not going to take it as a continuation of a centuries-old tradition. He will even argue that there's a special something about the American language and so on. We
Right.
get in lots of trouble there.
Right.
But the real answer to the trouble is go read Williams and into the vitality of that language, the spectacularity of being able to go down a road and list things and have them somehow become part of the imagination of what it is to be in your own place in your own time is important. So a poet like George Bowring picks this up, and he'll put it, as he does in one book, in Alberta, and another book in Saskatchewan, in another in British Columbia. And so that the particularity constantly builds, and then, well, I mean, my tendency is I love to read them to see how large that particularity associates itself with all kinds of largenesses, and certainly it does in Williams, and it does in George Bowring, and I even went about that in a preface I did for a selected poems of George Bowring.
Well, and that's what's so amazing about your work, the largeness, the context, the cosmology that emerges and that you're working for and toward, which seems to be lost in many of the what I poets, the egotistical sublime poets of a lyric tradition today.
The egotistical sublime, yes, and I, who made that charge against the romantics in the first place, and then it goes on. The problem, the problem with that is that you get to the point when you have a poetry that always poses the absolute assurance of the I in charge of everything. You know, it's about as mistaken as the man or woman that gets in a car and is unaware of everything else and just drives. Well, you're going to have a crash. And the whole notion of that control of the I tends, in my view, to be reductive of the world we work to draw together. So, well, as Jack Spicer said, you know, I'm tired of talking about my weeps and whines. And I think people get very tired of listening to weeps and whines. And when Charles Olson was talking, you know, it's just, we've gone beyond where weeping at the public wall is all that interesting anymore. We've got a bigger job to do. So I think the notion of limiting all poetry to that lyric voice by which I can tell you, I loves this person very much, and then you come back to me and say, well, what does she look like? Well, there's nobody there except the sentiment of what I have dropped all over. Well, if I do that to a mountain, I mean, how would you like to look at a mountain with my slop all over it? You know, this sort of thing. So yes, I think there's a real problem there. I also think that, and we're using George Bowring as an example here because I've worked on him, Louis Dudek, who stands back behind modernism to postmodernism in Canada, and is very clearly in some part a contributor to George Bowring's imagination. All these make efforts to move in a relational field, very different from one another, but they in a relational field that in which you find yourself in a world, and then maybe there's a self. But I don't think there's a terribly exciting self if you just sit there and weep, whine, or laugh, or whatever in your own.
All right, and one of your serial poems that I particularly like is "Truth is Laughter," which is a kind of answer to that weeping too, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. Of course, hidden behind that title, not only is the hook. But also, I really hope the truth is laughter.
All right.
Since we haven't got any notion what the truth is.
But why not enjoy it, eh?
Why not enjoy it?
Yes.